Please enjoy this ad-free episode as part of our Academic Integrity series sponsored by Pangram Labs, the world's leading AI detection tool. Try it out at pangram.com. That's pangram.com.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to ed up on the Ed Up Experience podcast, where we make education your business. This is Elvin Freitas, co-founder of the Ed Up Experience, and we are back on another awesome episode of our Academic Integrity series. And with me, as usual, is the co-host who is the most. He is Bradley Emmy, and he is the co-founder and CTO at Pangram Labs. Bradley, how you doing?
Oh, super excited to be here. I think we've got a really good one today.
Oh, yes, we do. And you know how we work. We go right into it. So let me introduce her. She is Dr. Greer Murphy, and she is the director of the Academic Integrity Office at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the vice president for strategy at the International Center for Academic Integrity, also known as ICAI. Greer, how you doing today?
I'm doing so good. It's so great to be with you both.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We always appreciate and value when people have time to hang out with us and talk about academic integrity. So we like to get right into it. First question is, Greg, tell us about you. Tell us about everything you do. How do you do it? What do you do? All that stuff. Go for it.
Wow. How much time do we have for just this question? So I do serve as director of the relatively newly formed, it's about a year old, which is how long I've been in the role, Academic Integrity Office at the UC Santa Cruz. Okay. Now, prior to that, academic integrity work had been done on campus, just in a decentralized way. So my role now involves bringing together our 10 undergraduate colleges and the academic and administrative leadership of those colleges to do the full 360 on academic integrity, everything from education and outreach, how we support students, staff, and faculty in knowing the institution's expectations for honest and independent completion of work, supporting faculty in understanding their rights and kind of responsibilities and obligations under the policy to do things like make their class-specific expectations known to students and to follow up when they suspect that work may not have been done or when they don't feel they can authenticate work may have been done honestly and independently, and kind of how they work through the formal misconduct process. There are a lot of folks in integrity work who do kind of one or two pieces of integrity, right? They might focus more on education outreach. Their role might be particular to resolution and adjudication. And one of the things that was really appealing to me about taking this role when I did just over a year ago was that it really does a little bit of everything. It also builds, and that was super appealing to me. Prior to academic integrity, I came from a background of first-year composition, rhetoric composition, multilingual writing, but also did a lot of program building from the ground up, curriculum design type of things. So that's what I loved about this job, and the vision at Santa Cruz to do that work in a robust, centralized way was really wonderful. And it's been just a wild, impactful, challenging, and also really fun ride in the year that I've been doing that work. Similar, I would say, a lot of the same things about my involvement with ICAI. I particularly started to get involved in my last role at the University of Rochester, which was my first full-time role within academic integrity. Came to know ICAI's work, went to the last conference prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was in Portland, Oregon, and remembered sitting in a session around some of the survey work that the ICAI leadership was doing at that time to reinvigorate Don McCabe's research into student perspectives on academic integrity. And I remember sticking up my hand and saying, well, that's excellent, but I know from the reading that I've done that McCabe also researched faculty perspectives. When is the team going to work on reinvigorating that particular survey? And when the answer came back that there hadn't been bandwidth, that hadn't been a champion of that project on behalf of ICAI yet, I stuck up my hand and said, well, what if I take that on then? And a few years later, led those research efforts. I've kind of transitioned now to thinking about some bigger picture strategy challenges for the organization, but really enjoy working closely with colleagues in that group who, like my work at Santa Cruz, do a little bit of everything with respect to academic integrity, from education to resolution to research. So that's a little bit about me.
Wow, that's fantastic, and thank you for laying down that that foundation, and putting us in the context. And so, with all that, I'm very curious to hear how do you define academic integrity?
Excellent question. For me, what it comes down to is practice, what we do, right? Not just what we say or what we believe or what we hope we believe, but what we do. You'll hear ICEI folks talk about the 6 fundamental values and the importance of adhering to those, even under stress and pressure. And within those, the keys for me, aside from it being seeing integrity as a practice, really are transparency, which isn't technically one of those named fundamental values, and trust, which is. So it's not about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about, I think, to what extent do we as individuals act with transparency, and how much can we or can others trust that the work we do in an academic context, especially, is a truthful and accurate reflection of what we know and what we can do and where we're still learning, particularly. There's lots of implications for instructors, of course. So a question I might ask there is, are we doing our best from a faculty perspective to create conditions where students know not just what, but how, and feel empowered to do their most authentic, accurate reflection of their abilities work? From an administrative institutional perspective, I might ask, how well are we partnering with faculty to help them make those learning conditions possible? And what do we kind of, big picture, stepping back to all of higher education, right? What do we recognize? What do we reward? And how are colleges and universities approaching this work from a systems and sustainability perspective? We can't be perfect. We can't resource or fund everything that we want to. But if we communicate with each other with respect for differences and, above all, transparency and trust, I think we can live up to the ideal of practicing integrity.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, yeah, I think you touched so many bases with that one, and I think I think a misconception that people often have with academic integrity is it's just like, oh, it's just the professor's responsibility to prevent cheating, and it's like actually in like so much wider than that, right? Like when you talk about like the system perspective, it's like how can we create like a framework across the entire university that supports, that relationship between professors and students, right? And like, I guess like in your opinion, like when we talk about like, I guess like practice and like, building an academic integrity system, like let's say that, you are going to a university that has, no centralized academic integrity office or no centralized strategy for academic integrity. Like, where would you recommend that like people start?
Oh, wow. So I think every member of an academic community has a role to play in upholding integrity, and certainly has ideas about it, whether they've had, been given space to examine what those are, or start to unpack what those are or not. In part, this may be because of my own academic and professional path. I really do think the heart of academic integrity, it's not only a faculty issue by any means, for exactly the reasons we've already discussed. But I think the leaders, the really kind of standard bearers, if you will, for the sustainable application of academic integrity, the culture setters, starts with faculty. Those are the folks, students. Well, I realize I'm going to talk myself into just a little bit of a corner here, but let me see if I can both do that and say and talk myself back out and then say what I mean.
Love it.
Which is that students, of course, without a student culture of academic integrity, that's a non-starter too, right? But students come to institutions of higher education for 4 years, maybe 5 or 6. They pursue graduate degrees, so maybe a couple of years longer than that. But the folks who are going to be setting the tone as future cohorts of students come and go and graduate and move on to the rest of their lives and careers and, everything that they hope, are going to be instructors, are going to be faculty. So I think when it comes to maintaining a culture, it really is that permanent. I'm going to put an asterisk on that for sustainability and everything we know about the challenges of, for instance, the adjunctification of higher education and how hard it can be to provide education from that sustainable place. But at least ideally, those faculty are going to be there after cohorts of students have come and gone. And so I think I would encourage institutions to bring faculty voices together and to look at what resources are already available on campus. So if there's a teaching and learning center, which is the case here at UC Santa Cruz, our TLC has been around, I'm going to get the numbers a little bit wrong, but about 10, 11 years at this point, and is a super respected partner, has been absolutely influential to the work I've been able to do, how quickly I've been able to do it over the last year or so. And so whatever the trusted place where faculty can go to either speak in confidence, to get support with any type of their faculty responsibilities, particularly classroom-related responsibilities, is where I would urge folks to begin conversations about what integrity and integrity support should mean and should look like on campus.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would love to just dive in a little bit more about like kind of how year one has just gone for you at UC Santa Cruz. Because I mean, I think like the ICAI people are always talking about like, yeah, academic integrity, like make it someone's job. Like this is so important. And you're a living example of like a university that decided to go make it someone's job, right? So yeah, how has that looked for you? And kind of like what have been kind of some of the surprises, unexpected turns? Like, yeah, just kind of would love to hear more.
Sure. Yeah. So it was a really wonderful opportunity that I, hadn't sought, wasn't really thinking it would be a thing, and just saw the job ad and thought, okay, here goes an institution going all in on making it someone's job. I got to go see what this is about.
Yeah.
So it's been like a really wonderful year of learning the culture of the institution. This is the first public university that I've worked at. It's by far the biggest university that I've worked at. And it's also, with respect to the way academic integrity work had functioned prior to the office coming on board, been the most decentralized. When I was back at the University of Rochester, the academic honesty kind of team or constellation of folks who made up the team oversaw the College of Arts and Sciences and the School of Engineering. But there were whole other divisions that were managed by different folks that our work back there didn't directly touch. And so the big swing at the bat that this institution took in planting that flag and creating this office, right? They did so with the recognition that it was always going to take time to identify some of the changes and some of the ways that centralization was going to have academic integrity education and resolution look a little different. So it's really been a year, first and foremost, of learning and kind of needs analysis and understanding the community. And we're right at the point now where I'm starting to talk with colleagues here and our provosts who are really kind of dean level positions. Each of the undergraduate colleges here is headed by a role we call provost, and working with that group to identify what are some of the changes that we're going to want to institute now and implement as a community. Because I think coming in here with some of the best practice ideas and the research experience that I bring and the involvement from ICAI, the wrong way to do it would have been to roll in and say, all right, I know what's best. Everybody stand back and watch. UCSC did make it someone's job, but I don't have a mandate so much as I need to create a movement. And it's really been that like community building, movement building, and now at the point of starting to implement a couple of process and kind of policy adjustments, let's say, which is super exciting.
Yeah, for sure. What's kind of differed the most between like your expectation coming in and what you actually kind of learned through that kind of listening tour?
Oh, wow. What has been the most different? That is excellent. I don't know that anything about the content of what folks have shared has been different than the kinds of things I would have expected. Maybe the depth of folks' feelings about academic integrity, and I really do mean all the feelings, right? So everything from um, concerns about the system or the policy or the work my new office might do, might involve continuing to quote unquote come down too hard on students.
Yeah, and are these feelings from faculty, from students, like kind of, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
um, so I've done a lot of those listening to our tech meetings with faculty, some with staff, and some with students. I have a new colleague. Part of building out the office has been to bring on a wonderful colleague, education specialist position, who's been really taking the lead on a lot of the student outreach. So we're beginning to get more student voices now, which is wonderful. But I started with faculty. And so a lot of folks from any number of different disciplines having really different experiences and really different but really strong feelings about both where academic integrity had been prior to the office, and then where they want, hope, and in some cases like fear academic integrity might be going. So I think that the magnitude, I knew this was a campus that cared deeply about academic integrity. Otherwise, they wouldn't have created the office or the position that I hold. But to see how deeply that care resonated on down to graduate student instructors, right? Folks who were just dipping their toes in college teaching for the first time while pursuing their research and own educational careers has been really, I don't know that I would say surprising, but really affirming and really heartening to see how much this community really cares. It doesn't mean we always agree with each other, but how much we all really care about trying to get this academic integrity work right.
Yeah, why do you think like academic integrity brings out such strong emotions in people?
Wow. Woof. Gosh.
We come here and ask the heavy
$65,000
hitters.
questions.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. I think it really gets to the core of a lot of deep feelings and sense of belonging or lack of sense of belonging, kind of insecurity almost, that various stakeholders in the academic project, whoa, that's a big phrase, folks who work in higher education, right, feel, whether we really kind of know it or not, right? So when a student, for instance, gets a notification that a faculty member suspects they might not have completed their work honestly, it's really easy to leap from that, to go, oh my God, someone's saying I don't belong here, which 9.9999999 repeating times out of 10 isn't the faculty member's intent at all, right? The faculty member is trying to do the job that they were hired to do, which is to not just support students' learning, but certify it and validate it. Both that professor and the institution they work at have obligations to society, really, to get that part of the work done. But a student might take that, particularly with at a public institution like UC Santa Cruz, students come from all sorts of different pathways, right? And so a student who may not have had a family history of, mom's a lawyer, dad's a doctor, parents are PhDs. If it's a first generation college student, how is someone like that not going to read on some level a concern about their academic performance as uncertainty over, do I really belong here? So from a student perspective, I think it's really, in linguistics, we call it face threatening, but really kind of identity threatening, getting to the core of who we are, who we want to be, how we need others to perceive us. And I don't think it's dissimilar for faculty or staff, actually. Are we doing everything that we can and that we hope and that we want to support students? Is someone going to call us out on not being great at teaching? Just to pick a piece of the faculty role. Okay, well, faculty haven't been trained to teach, typically, not trained in the sense of, you know, an official dedicated part of their doctoral career, typically, with time, space, reflection to work on their teaching. It may happen informally, it very often does. I don't mean to suggest that all PhD advisors are, you know, don't spend time and space on that. But by and large, without the support to learn to teach deliberately, you get faculty in a classroom who construct an assignment and then might feel personally attacked when it looks like a student has cheated on it, or when a student has cheated on it. How could they have done this to me? I can't tell both of you the number of times I've walked an instructor through that moment of like, okay, I know that it feels personal. I promise you it isn't actually, most of the time. And so it really, to try to bring it back home, really gets wrapped up in identity, personal, professional, and otherwise, I think. And it's in ways that can be hard to separate, but that we feel in our core, right? So the depth and the magnitude that most people, when they get down to it, feel connected to integrity on some level, I think comes from that.
Oh, definitely. And it's so interesting because, yeah, it kind of goes back to the reasons why students cheat in the first place, too. Like, we hear so often from students like, oh, like, you know, I feel like all of my classmates are using AI and turning in essays that are going to be way better than mine, like if I wrote mine by hand. And so they feel like in order to be part of the in-group, like in order to feel like they belong, they feel like this is like, you know, often their only option. And so, yeah, kind of these motivations, like everyone's just trying to kind of like look over their shoulder a little bit and just kind of try and figure out where their place is. And that makes sense why like cheating is so stigmatized and why cheat is such a like stigmatized word. Like it's essentially you telling someone like, hey, you you know, you don't belong here in a way.
The kind of, yeah, the sort of the specter of shame on the one hand, whether any folks mean to emphasize that or not, just always seems present on some level. And then the other thing that you mentioned around, you know, what are my peers doing, makes me think too, not just, you know, peer culture, peer pressure, and everything we know about how that influences motivation and behavior, but achievement too. It's super legitimate for folks to come to higher ed and want their degrees to not only mean something, but also be a stepping stone. And so that concern over, am I going to get left behind if I don't, maybe it's not even cheat because our minds are wild. We can rationalize almost anything, right? If I don't take a shortcut, or if I don't conveniently neglect to ask my professor just exactly what their expectations are about using artificial intelligence. So a syllabus might say, well, don't use it for brainstorming, but you can use it for grammar checking or late stage revision. That's pretty clear, but it's not 100% clear. And so when I'm concerned about what the folks around me are doing, and it's maybe just a day or a few hours before the assignment is due, am I going to step back, breathe, take the time to say, okay, I'm going to send an email to my professor. I'm going to make 1,000% sure I know exactly what they want from me. Or am I going to take the risk of just making my best guess in a moment of not even panic, but just in a moment of working quickly, turn it in, and then see what happens. I absolutely understand those challenges and the contexts that students can find themselves in with respect to that.
And it takes a lot of vulnerability to go out and ask your professor, like, hey, is this okay? Because I think they're worried about the blowback of like the professor being like, no, that's not okay. How could you even think that?
Right. And not even just, you know, there might be actual material grade-based consequences, but I really do think there's that identity piece of wanting a professor to see you as competent, smart, hardworking, you know, insert the adjective here, right? And so that, I love that you brought up that word, Bradley. I think vulnerability is so huge and acknowledging the vulnerability that it takes to admit when we don't necessarily know the answer from a student perspective, to admit from a faculty perspective that, hey, maybe it's been a minute or a semester or a year or more since we've had a chance to look at our assignments and ask ourselves if they're really supporting independent and honest completion of work. It's super vulnerable to do that. And so then what space are institutions making for that vulnerability to happen?
Definitely. And like I think like, we've had, like Trisha and like, other people on the podcast come and talk about how like that moment is like so like not too dissimilar from like therapy, where you kind of need to like de-escalate the situation emotionally and create like a safe space for people to be vulnerable. It's like vulnerability is like kind of that first step in like having honesty, transparency, trust, like kind of like all of these values that we espouse, right?
It's super huge. Yeah. One of the smartest things, and this is before I ever came into academic integrity work professionally, I was still in writing studies and rhetoric and composition at that time. I was at a writing program administrators conference, and I heard someone say a thing that they had heard, I believe from a therapist. I forget the context exactly, but it was around the idea of pursuing institutional change. And the thing she said was everyone experiences change on some level as loss, even when we support the change, even when we know the change is good. And so I think about what that means for faculty who have had to change their practice so many times, starting with, at most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, heading into the age of artificial intelligence. There's huge loss and huge, it's going to sound like a big word, but I'll stand behind it, like kind of grief associated with that. And giving space to process and then say, all right, but now let's get down to business because this is the new reality. This is where we're at. And there's certainly student and staff corollaries too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like we could go on about this, but I wanted to kind of pivot directions a little bit and make sure we get to some of your recent work. So you and your colleagues have done this big horizontal study of policy, right, across many different institutions, and not just UC Santa Cruz, on artificial intelligence, and was just hoping you could share with our audience a little bit about kind of what motivated the work and kind of what are kind of some of the key takeaways that you guys found.
Sure, yeah. So my colleague Courtney Cullen and I did a study of 100 academic integrity policies from all sorts of types of institutions of higher education within the US. And we were motivated to do that study because similar work had been done internationally. So folks in Canada, an academic in Australia, Tracy Breitag, really kind of pioneered a lot of this exemplary policy framework, which we borrowed from and adapted to look at US policies. And there hadn't been any US study of kind of the state of academic integrity policy. So we recognized that 100 policies wasn't necessarily a lot. There are actually something like 4,500, give or take, institutions of higher education in the US. Thank you, Carnegie Classification in the IPEDS database for helping us find that out. So 100 is a drop in the bucket, but a place to start, right? To look at how our institutions articulating. You can't see everything about how an institution does integrity work from a written policy, right? But how are we articulating our commitments to academic integrity? How clearly are we signaling to all sorts of stakeholders, perhaps starting with students, that operational definition, not just of what integrity is, but how to practice it and how to abide by it? And then are those statements really reflecting the values and practices that we want them to? And if they're not, what do we kind of do about that? So really wanting to shine a light on, are our policies truly reflecting the values that we as institutions say or like to say that we hold?
Interesting. Gotcha. Yeah. And so were you like kind of looking at kind of the gap between policy and practice too, or just like kind of just the policies?
starting from policy, there's,
Yeah.
and part of that was kind of that feasibility study of wanting to get a policy
Sure.
piece out first. A really good next step that Courtney and I have talked about would be to dig into some deeper, perhaps interview-based kind of follow-up benchmarking with some of the folks whose policies we studied to really look at that, how practice pairs with policy, because there's work to be done there too, for sure. But really wanted to keep it to different dimensions of policy, including, this is kind of the bridge between policy and practice, perhaps, what the framework we borrowed from Britag and colleagues calls support. So not just what the expectations are for academic integrity, but what supports are available to students, faculty, staff at the institution for implementing that policy. And are those supports named in the policy itself, or do they live kind of outside of the policy, hidden on a website somewhere, or known only to folks who are physically present on the campus and doing the work? And if that's the case, which, spoiler, it very often is, it's quite the exception for supports to be explicitly named and mentioned and committed to in the context of a policy document, then what does that mean for an individual institution about how clearly we're making the resources available to the people who we think should have them? And then again, big picture, because I always like to operate both at 300 feet and at 30,000 feet. Big picture, what does that mean for us in higher ed, in US higher ed, for how well we aren't doing this?
Yeah, and it doesn't surprise me that like support is like kind of like a little bit spotty in the policy, because the policy has this optimistic view that like, oh, if everyone follows the policy, then nobody's going to cheat and nobody's going to need support. But yeah, again, it's kind of this practice versus, this policy versus reality kind of
and it's interesting you bring up optimism, because one of the things that we found in the tone of the policy, and this makes sense when you think about the legacy and the history of US higher education and policy and compliance documents generally in that context. Very often, these policies don't sound as optimistic on paper as they might sound if you talk to someone who worked at the institution, which is to say they're often articulated in complex, kind of legalistic language. And so fine, a compliance document is always going to need to have a certain amount of quote unquote lawyer talk in it, whether a lawyer has had direct input on the articulation of that document or not. And that's important, but then how accessible does that make a document to members of an institution? Very often there's that trade-off between, is it sounding legalistic, complex, that can sound scary. Is that intended or not intended? One of the things that we might explore in follow-up work to the piece that we published would be gleaning that sense of, or trying to, that sense of intent with respect to the policy. So talking to stakeholders from the institutions in response to some of the work we've done about how their policy sounds. So there can be optimism expressed in a policy document. We found that was a bit more the exception in the data set that we reviewed than the rule. And even when there was aspirational language around academic integrity that got away explicitly from legalistic kind of crime, punishment, guilt talk, that tended to be abandoned pretty quickly once the policy documents got to the resolution adjudication procedure step. So there was a big disconnect even amongst the policies that aspired to more inspirational, aspirational, positive, proactive language between kind of how they started and then where they ended. So that's something we'd be interested in looking more at eventually.
Interesting, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, we just wrapped up like a big cybersecurity audit at Pangram, so I'm like very familiar with like all this like legalistic mumbo jumbo that we have to stuff in there to appease all of the stakeholders that need to review that, right? And so, it's like when you're looking at a policy, you're always thinking about like who is this policy for? Like, is it to
Exactly.
protect the university from harm? Is it to protect the students? And like in many cases, it's all of the above, right? And so,
Exactly right. Yes. Yeah. No, there's other colleagues that I know. Christian Moriarty and Blair Wilson did a great piece a couple of years ago that Courtney and I leaned on for our work on justice and consistency in policymaking. Christian, who you might know of, is a lawyer by training. And so that I think really is one of the points in their piece that we drew from in our work is just that you need to have both justice, a policy that's fair, and then a policy that's consistent. And very often those goals are in tension with each other, if not in outright imbalance, right? You have to kind of lean one way or lean the other. And so I totally get what you're saying about stakeholders and needing to satisfy and be credible to all sorts of different stakeholders.
right, for sure. Because like it's almost like number one priority of the policy is like, you know, if there is a dispute between the student and the university, like this gives something for I guess like the university to stand on when they're like, okay, no, this was the policy. Like this wasn't like, you know, Professor Elvin, like, you know, just deciding to, you know, punish me because he hates me.
Yeah, right. You were 5 minutes late, and just that offense shall not stand, Bradley, or whatever it might be, right? It's really trying to protect I think all members of a community and also the institution itself. And that's valid. That's important. We shouldn't not do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, no, I was going to say, we're coming up on time. Unfortunately, so unfortunate.
So went so fast. No way.
Right? So, Bradley, I think you have one more question you wanted to talk about.
No, I mean, I think I was just kind of wondering, like, you know, aside from kind of the language around support and like, you know, some of the other things, like what were kind of like some of the biggest differences that you found in these policies? And like, I guess, like, what do you think those differences kind of reflect?
Really good question. So one of the surprises for sure was that institutions, so we tried to take a fairly representative cross-section of variable institutional types. We went after community colleges, we went after Hispanic serving institutions, other kinds of HBCUs, minority serving institutions, not to the exclusion of, you know, your stereotypical Ivy League R1s, but trying to get just a kaleidoscope of schools included in our review. And a couple of the surprises for us were that institutions that were more open in their access, so HSIs, community colleges, that type of thing, had policy documents that were more legalistic, more complicated, higher reading complexity scores, so probably more challenging to understand than some of your R1s. And so that seems to be paradoxical, except when you consider that likely institutions with the most open access might be institutions with the least amount of institutional resources dedicated to explaining a policy well, to carving space for support to be mentioned within the policy. And so it's a paradox that makes sense when you step back and think about the full context. We found similar results from the schools that we looked at that were honor code, honor council schools, which we often think of as being, and this is true, they're really good at integrating student perspectives, particularly that true honor council model where students may be the primary resolution drivers and decision makers. They might be the ones serving on hearing boards, determining with a case of suspected cheating, whether it's cheating or whether it's not. Those schools, the handful that we pulled in our set, and again, I'll put the asterisk that it really was just a handful, we should do more research, tended to have more complicated, more legalistic, harder to understand language in the policy documents themselves. And so on the one hand, student voices represented, student stakeholders are represented, and on the other, that may not be coming through in how the policies are framed.
Very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating insights, and I wish we had more time. Maybe you'll come back another time, Greer, because
I would love to. In fact, I suspect you're going to have trouble keeping me away. But it's been an awesome conversation.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so let's get to our last question, which we ask everybody on the Academic Integrity series. What do you see as the future of academic integrity?
Oh, goodness. This is going to sound perhaps a little Pollyanna-ish, but I think the future is community, is solidarity, is hopefully riding the double waves of not just the COVID pandemic, but also the generative artificial intelligence movement, to really come together as an individual institution, as a community of higher education, and say, academic integrity can be a really wicked problem. Maybe I would reframe that as a challenge, and maybe then I would reframe that as an opportunity to say, how can we all support each other in doing this work better, rather than the kind of the traps we can fall into of silos, of dividing lines, of faculty versus students or administrators versus faculty. We're all in this together. And so I do think the visibility and the recognition that integrity work is starting to get as a result of those two kind of crises in higher education may be enough to turn the tide, to increase the way in which we all support each other. That's my hope. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned community. Bradley and I were talking about that earlier today.
We were just talking about it. Yeah,
I know it's a big theme today. I love that. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me first outro my co-host, who everybody should know by now is the most. He is Bradley Emmy. He's CTO and co-founder at Pangram Labs. Thank you as always, Bradley.
Oh, thanks as always for letting me yap, Elvin.
You get better and better. I love it. And so our guest today, your guest today, is Dr. Greer Murphy, Director of the Academic Integrity Office at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the Vice President for Strategy at the International Center for Academic Integrity, ICAI. Greer, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you both for having me.
Absolutely. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, you've just ed-upped.
Thank you for listening. This episode is part of our Academic Integrity series sponsored by Pangram Labs, the world's leading AI detection technology. Try it out at pangram.com. That's PANGRAM.com.